Well, I'm finally starting the video on the Cathars. A very strange, misunderstood, and I think very misinterpreted group that existed in southern France for sure in the 18th, in the 1100s, 1200s, even into the 1400s, if you accept conventional dating. And that's one of the things we'll talk about in this video. There's a tremendous amount of misinterpretation about this group, and I think they are very important to our world story right now. That in some ways, what the Cathars really were is our role models. And this area of southern France I've studied for a number of years now, not just the Cathars, but the Knights Templar, the strange stories around Rennes-le-Château, and there are many other stories of strange priests in the same period in the 1800s, all through southern France, that have unbelievable, bizarre stories around them. And hopefully we'll get to a lot of the stories of southern France, but to start with, we'll begin with the Cathars. And I want to give a short 2-minute overview, because many people, I think this video might turn out to be an hour. I have no idea how long this is going to be. And so I want to give a short overview. Why would the Cathars be important if somebody's only going to watch 2 or 3 minutes? You have to remember, this was a persecuted group, the first group that the Catholic Church called a crusade on within their own faith. So previously, all crusades had been against Muslims in the Holy Land. This was the first time they called a crusade to eliminate and kill off a group of people who considered themselves to be Christians. Although, obviously, when you look into their beliefs, you could call them a mixture of early Gnostic Christianity, native Indian medicine, and Buddhist, very fundamental Buddhist teachings. That would be the best way. If you could take those 3 elements and combine them, that's probably what you see of the Cathars. But they have some very key, important elements, and I'm just going to read you 2 quotes again to get us started, so that the people who are only going to watch a few minutes get a couple of pieces of information with them. This is a quote from 1250 about the Cathars. They teach that their world will never come to an end, and that the last judgment has already been made, and that hell, eternal fire, and eternal punishment are all in this world and nowhere else. That's an important and key Cathar element we're going to come to, that there is no hell after death. The hell is now. The world, this particular reality, is hell. That it was made by the false god, as we will see, and everything within it is evil, or at least false and untrue. And the only way one can obtain salvation is to turn away from everything in the material. And that led them to have some very unique views of who this figure known as Christ was, and what this figure might have really been, which again links more closely to the Gnostics, more closely to the ancient Egyptians, than anything of modern or Middle-aged Catholicism. A second quote to keep in mind. The teachings were not focused on how someone lived, a good life or a bad life. It was more important as to how much knowledge of death did someone have. The right knowledge would turn death into a positive experience. And that's another key element. The Cathars, while being in a physical body, dealing with unique concepts of reincarnation, believe that the only thing that would matter to them is a combination of how they lived, a very strange ceremony that they went through, and their awareness upon the moment of death to return to, as they called them, the stars of the sky, or to return back to the original source, or the good God, as they called it. And only with a knowledge of death and a knowledge and understanding of the evilness of the modern world could that happen. So, I think that makes them very important role models for what's happening now. I think the crusade and the Inquisition was set up for the Cathars originally, not for any other group. It became a much more widely used practice throughout history by the Catholic Church, but it was started simply for the Cathars. And all of those things, I think, those elements are going to be seen again very shortly in the world we live in. So that's a short overview. Now let's go into the detail about Cathars, some of who they are, some of my questioning of the dating period, because I think what happened to the Cathars happened much more close to our times. We'll get at the end to some of the strange stories around Cathar Grail, Cathar castles, which logically and historically don't make any sense. We'll talk a bit about the Holy Grail and the Cathars' connection to the Grail, and tremendous detail on the surviving information that we have about them. Because the first piece to understand is we have almost no information directly from the Cathars. Most of the information comes from various Inquisition documents from the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church is presenting most of what we know or have available at this point of Cathar knowledge, which is kind of like only knowing about the Jewish faith from the documents of the Nazi Gestapo and SS from the 1930s. The persecutors are the only piece of information we have, but we have little bits, little surviving elements that can take us into a bit more detail into their story. I'm not going to put any pictures or anything over top of the screen. I would recommend, if you do want to look at some things while I'm talking, you go to a really interesting website. It's called, I think it's cathar.info. Cathar.info. I'll put the link below. Really good website, really good useful information by the gentleman, James MacDonald, I think is his name. Yeah, James MacDonald. And on the front page, there's 100 sort of what you might call old manuscript images and photographs of the Cathar area in southern France. So if you don't have to look at my balded head, you can go to that website, that the link is below, and scroll through some of those pictures while I'm talking, and it might give you a much more direct insight into Cathar knowledge. So let's begin, shall we? So Catharism is called a Christian dualist movement that thrived in some areas of southern Europe, particularly northern Italy and southern France between the 12th and 14th centuries. Again, part of the problem with piecing together who the Cathars were and what they believed is because we have so little from them directly stored. In fact, there were only 2 books, I believe, of Cathar teachings or hymns or prayers that have actually survived. You have to remember, this is a very strange period in history, assuming the history is correct. For now, we'll assume the history is true. But you're dealing with the first crusade in the Middle East, happened in 1099. A group of 8 unknown French monks were given the job of protecting all the travelers to the Holy Land in 1129, the Knights Templar, who chose to make southern France their base of operations. They, of course, amassed a fortune. At the same time, a group which some claim seemed to have come from southeastern Europe, but no one is really sure where they arrived, came and had the name Cathars. Again, a very dualist, a very nature-based, and a very unique type of Christian organization. They called themselves good Christians. In fact, they used the name bons hommes for their high prefects, which were known as bons hommes, meaning good men in French. The Cathars believed that their theology is the original Christianity, and that the modern Christian church had corrupted and changed the doctrine to suit its own will, to suit its own power, to suit its own control, and that the Cathars are one of the few groups who are keeping this alive. Of course, the Catholic Church claimed that the opposite was true, that they were the ones who had the official knowledge and wisdom, and it was the Cathars who were, of course, causing the problems by believing in a wrong doctrine. But of course, the Cathars needed to be eliminated, killed, tortured, and destroyed for believing something different. In the first place, one of the key reasons that the Cathars believed they had the original knowledge is because they claimed that there were 2 actual gods, not one, and that there was an evil God and a good God. The evil god, also known as Rex Mundi, the king of the world, is the one who created this entire reality, created it all through error, and is the one who wrote the New Testament. For the god of killing and destruction and basically psychopathic, which is what the Old Testament is, to the Cathars, was something that was completely rejected. They rejected everything in the Old Testament as the work of this evil god. And in fact, they only believed some of the elements of the New Testament. While they believed the New Testament God is the God that they believed was the good God and that they should pray to, they also claimed that a good amount of what's in the New Testament has been changed around and is not clear to accurate doctrine. So there was only a few sections of the New Testament that they held sacred. I would assume they would have held many Gnostic documents, things that would have been in the Nag Hammadi fragments, etc., that they would have held those as original New Testament texts. They were also quite upset with the Roman Church had encouraged the worship of material objects, such as the relics of saints. And worse, it venerated the cross, not only as a material object, but also as an instrument of torture. This all seemed to confirm that the Roman Catholics were and are worshipping the God of evil who created this world, that the Roman Church perverted Christian scripture, replaced the ancient rites with the new ones, and persecuted any minorities. Here's an account of how the Cathars themselves seem to have seen themselves. We are the poor of Christ. We have no fixed abode, and flee from city to city like sheep, amidst wolves. We are persecuted as were the apostles and the martyrs, despite the fact that we lead the most strict and holy life, preserving day and night in fasts and abstinence, in prayers and in labor from which we seek only the necessities of life. We undergo this because we are not of this world. But you, lovers of this world, have peace with it because you are of the world. False apostles who pollute the word of Christ, who seek after their own interest, have led you and your fathers astray from the true path. That was recorded in 1143. Let me give you a quick overview of some of the key Cathar beliefs, very quickly. The first, any kind of procreative sex was bad, i.e. any sort of conception, because that would result in more souls being trapped in the prison world. So procreative sex was considered a sin in their world. As such, marriage was also worthless because it would lead only to potentially conception of more children. They had no problem with sexual relations between men and women as long as there was no children being conceived from it. The less had one to do with any material, i.e. evil things, the better. That including eating animal or animal products, although for some strange reason fish was allowed that we will examine. They believe that the sooner we can shed the flesh, the sooner our souls could fly like a spark of light back to heaven, to the realm of God. Thus, in this respect, there was no reason to discourage suicide. There was definitely no reason to see women as any better or worse than men. Both were equal because the soul was equal. The soul was just choosing a male body or a female body, or, as they can be considered, an animal body. So to the Cathars, all were equal and all were the same. And in fact, at a time when women were unbelievably persecuted by the Christian church, the Cathars had complete equality through their entire system. Since material objects were creations of the bad God, it was absurd to imagine they could be of any value. Jewels, money, relics, the Year Christ, reproductions of the cross, and church buildings were of no value whatsoever. All of their services were held generally out in nature. That's one of the reasons I'm out here today, because this is where the Cathars would hold church services, out in the open air, not in a certain building which they would claim would be an extra manifestation of this evil god. An interesting point to this that we will get into is their likely belief of either two Jesuses, again, dualism, a good Jesus and an evil Jesus, or that most likely the good Jesus could not have been a physical being in the physical world and saw him more as a hologram. But again, we'll get into all of that. I have a giant amount of notes, so it's going to take me a little bit of time as I flip through the notes here to give you the details. So first we have the name Cathars, which is hard to understand because no one is actually even sure what the name means. It is suggested that it comes from Greek, either meaning the word purity or meaning from the word catharsis, some type of, which is of course a cleansing, usually found in the Greek tragedies, the Greek dramas, where the viewing of the drama in a way it was presented would create an inner catharsis and an inner cleansing. But this is very strange because, of course, the people calling them Cathars that's not the name they called themselves. We actually don't know what they called themselves. This is what their opponents began to call them. So it would seem strange that an opponent would want to use a word like purity or something positive to describe a group that you intend to kill off, that you intend to exterminate. And so it's more likely the name might actually come from something else. One such suggestion is the German word for cat lover, because Cathars may have been seen, because cats were seen as evil by the Catholic Church, and it might have been easy to connect this religion with the evil cats. You have to remember that on May the 1st, deep into the Middle Ages, that was the day that the Catholic Church rounded up all the cats in a town and burned them. They burned all the cats because they felt they might be holding witches inside. They kept doing this, of course, until no more rats were being killed and the plague started to break out, that they decided maybe cats had some value after that. But every May 1st, cats were taken and killed in all the villages around Europe. But that is one possible origin. And you also have to remember from their own mythology, if they're taking this back into ancient Egypt, where the creation of the world began with Atum, taking the form of the cat in order to chop off the head of Nehekbau, the evil serpent, and be able to create the world. Another possible, of course, origin for the word Cathar can be from the Kabbalist word Kether, which is the top of their tree of life. The name for the crusade, it wasn't a Cathar crusade, it was called the Albigensian crusade, named after one of the cities, not actually even the first city where the first crusade massacre started, the city of Albi, but seemed to be some sort of haven for Cathar knowledge in that part of France. So again, we have all these terminologies and all these words that is hard to even know why those words were being used. No one is sure when Catharism started, no one's sure when it came to southern France, and no one's even sure why it became so popular. Again, it seems to have its roots in Armenia and Bulgaria, taking influence from the Paulinians, but they do know that in this time frame, in the 10th and 11th century, we begin to see this group in southern France. And you have to remember, which we'll get to when I get to later videos on southern France, there is a lot of ancient Egyptian influence in that area. And in fact, I believe southern France holds a pretty huge secret. And I think I might have the direction of that secret. I'm not ready to share it yet. I need a little more proof before I want to say it openly, but it would be pretty history changing if my theories are correct. But there is a lot of ancient Egyptian names, settlements, objects, very strange stuff found in southern France. A lot of people try to make them out as the original New Agers. That's how they try to present them now, like New Age thinking. They were all vegetarian, loved the earth, sat with their crystals, sang songs around the fire, and again, no. I would more compare them as a trinity between Buddhists, native Indian medicine, and early Gnostic Christianity. They lived in an area of France known as the Languedoc. And the Languedoc comes from a very specific set of words that mean the language of Ak, which is the language of 8. Ak is Ossetian. They call it Ossetian, but Ossetian is 8. And it's known as a sacred language, and thrice 8 is the number of Hermes. It's also considered the sacred number of Jesus. And so you are talking about potentially the name of the place being the land of Tahuti, the land of Hermes, the land of Jesus. It can also be from the similar to the Egyptian word, which is Ak, A-A-K-H, which means light, or a spirit being of light. So again, you've got the Langu Dak, which could be the land of the light, or the land of the spirit. Good time for you to take a drink of something as we continue. I've got 10 sections to go with this. I've done 2, just so you have an idea of where we're moving. We're not even anywhere close to Cathar beliefs yet, and some of the key structures for today. Okay, section 3, dualism. And this is one of the things I've discussed about. There's always 2 to everything. There's a good God, there's a bad God. There's masculine, there's feminine. There's matter, and there's spirit. And dualism is absolutely critical to understanding Cathar thinking, and understanding that to them, the entire material world, everything in the material world, comes from Rex Mundi, who is what you might call a way of depicting Satan or the devil. And so this interplay is constantly going on. So even in the material world, the good or the spirit is attempting to present itself. But the Cathars are saying anything material is disputing that direct connection. And anything I would assume once removed is less evil than something twice removed. So if this natural environment would be, to the Cathars, considered evil because it's material. But as soon as I take something from the material world and make something out of it, and particularly change it into another form, if I took a piece of a tree and turned it into a cup, that's really still in it, nothing has changed. I've just changed the shape or the structure of it. If I take something and create, whether, like, say, something like steel or something that's not actually existing in the material world, or the very chair I'm sitting in, for example, right? This chair would be considered a second generation of evil, I think, to the Cathars, because it's 2 steps removed from nature. They were very clear to recognize the feminine principle as equal to the masculine. The female principle of God would be Sophia, wisdom. So God would be an active principle, and the feminine would be all wisdom. So a very similar would be Isis and Osiris, would be a similar way of looking at how they viewed. And they're not just they're not 2 gods. There's one God, but there's 2 aspects. There's a masculine aspect and a feminine aspect, and both are equal and both are important. Section 4. Souls and reincarnation. Now, Cathars believe that human souls were genderless angels trapped within physical creation by Rex Mundi, which is, of course, this is a type of holographic realm. They don't see reality. They see more reality in a holographic way. That reality is a non-physical hologram. And these souls were trapped into this realm, put into material bodies, and will stay in material bodies, continually being reincarnated until they can obtain salvation, one of which was through the Consolamentum. This reincarnation process is not something to the way Buddhists would think of reincarnation. This is not about your life is going to be judged based on if you're nice or not, and your next reincarnation you'll be nicer or worse or whatever. Very simply, to them, all that happened is when you died, if you did not have enough knowledge of death to leave and escape this realm, then you would just jump into the first new body you found. And has nothing to do with any previous lives, past lives. They're useless in Cathar terminology. You're either trapped in the world of duality or you're not. You're either in the dream or you're not. You're either able to escape reincarnation at death or you're not. So to them, Buddhist thinking would be, they would consider it insane thinking, because then how you live is being judged, as opposed to how you are preparing for your death to not be reincarnated. Have to keep reading as I go along. The realm of the good God, which they thought of heaven, was filled with light. And some Cathars regarded all of the stars in the sky as divine souls, or the angels in heaven that we can see. The realm of the bad God was this material world, which serve out only earthly terms. Saturn had trapped these divine sparks of light and created humankind and animals as their prison. Thus there's a part of the good God trapped in all men and women and animals longing to rejoin its maker. The bad God filled humankind with temptation to frustrate souls from ever making the reunion. They could be tortured by disease, famine, and other travels, including man's own inhumanity to fellow men. Yet the bad God had no power over the soul, the divine spark of the good God. His area was only confined to material things. Thus the only hell that possibly exists is this material earth. Thus, to confound this bad God, to confound Rex Mundi, it's necessary to abstain from all earthly temptation and to strengthen the inner spirit through prayer. It was an argument that seemed to provide a rational explanation for what's going on in the world. If those manage to lead, and we're saying a good life here. Now, this is, again, don't think of this in the way Buddhist terms would be thinking about a judgment of specifically how you live, but a good life meaning a life of knowledge and understanding, reality, the spirit, the soul, your inner work. So a good life would be a life of knowledge, a life of acquiring deep knowledge. And if you had done that, then you would be able to be released from the cycle of rebirth. And upon that death, Rex Mundi would lose its control over that soul, and that soul would be able to escape back to the sky and become light, become natural light, which is of course exactly the same as the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians talked about if you die correctly, you'll become a star in the sky. This idea that the material or the flesh is evil was a very important part of parts of early Christianity, which slowly began taken away, which, as the church had to explain why it needed to be focused on money and power and control and material goods, it had to start showing a different viewpoint to the material world. The Cathars kept this original Christian viewpoint. Be reminded of a line by William Shakespeare, Act 1, Scene 2 in The Tempest. Hell is empty, all the devils are here. What's interesting is I've got a plane flying over. I'll just wait until the sound goes away here for you. Just look at the fish, I guess, jumping in the background over my shoulder. Has the plane left us? Flying over. It's claimed that some Cathars believe that there could only go 7 or 9 reincarnations, that the reincarnation won't just continue. So this is also interesting that you, unlike a Buddhist would say, well, you have 1 million reincarnations, there's no problem, there's no worry, there's no need to do any work, just do whatever you want. To the Cathar, they're saying they might only have 7 or 9 at the most, which means you don't have many opportunities to get this knowledge correct. You don't have much time to further your depth of the knowledge. The next key element, and I'll save this for later, is when it comes to the souls, is the danger of baptism. That to them, one of the greatest evils upon the earth is the baptism of John the Baptist, a water baptism, and that they were clear that the only baptism that mattered was the type of ceremony that they used, which they claimed was the most ancient of ceremony, the type that Jesus used, the good Jesus, which would be that of the holy fire, the baptism of fire, as opposed to the baptism of water. Section 5. Cathars were very clear in giving women the absolute equality that many wish they still had today. They were not just part of the congregation. They're not priests in this. They're called perfecti, people who had gone through their cleansing ceremony and shown their knowledge and their ability to do a few things, but there was often always a pair of them. So there would be a male and a female, and they would work together, travel together, live together. Again, this absolute equality. So for any healing, for any knowledge, for any wisdom, it didn't matter whether you went to the male or you went to the female. They were equal in their knowledge, equal in their ability, equal in their ability to... Now obviously one would have, like anything, one would be more naturally better at one thing than something else, so depending on what you needed, you would go to one or the other, but in the basic standpoint of Cathar knowledge, they're absolutely equal because one cannot be above the other because the soul, which is genderless, is the same in both of them. Again, we talked about a bit of why reproduction was considered improper, and again, because if you create another child, all you're really doing is creating another potential slave, another potential place for another soul to be trapped into this world. And the whole focus of their life was to escape the world, not be creating more bodies where more and more sparks of angelic light could be trapped in the material. So the greatest thing for them would be not to have physical children, but instead to have what you might say, similar to how a native Indian would call it, grandchildren, right? A wise medicine man or medicine woman doesn't have they're not their actual grandchildren. They're younger people who've been coming to study and learn from them, and they get called grandfather or grandmother as a sign of respect, and they consider them equal to their family because they're choosing knowledge. So to a Cathar, they would want to go and choose. Now this is again at a certain level. If you're still in the basics of the Cathar faith, let's get this also understood as I've come to see this and understand it. Until you reach a certain level or a certain point that will come to where you are under direct expectation for the rest of your life. Before you got to that point, you could still be a Cathar believer, you could still be a Cathar member, and you could be married, you could have children, you could eat meat, you could do all sorts of things depending on what you felt was best or not best for you in that time. But until you took a certain ceremony, and you might say took a certain vow that you were now officially, completely a Cathar, now you had to end all of those things. But before that point, before you reached your sort of, this sort of perfected state where you were now only preparing yourself for leaving the world, you could still do many of the things that were not allowed to the top. And I don't want to call them initiates because that's not the right way, because anybody could reach this point. They just had to put the work in. There was no secret order that was determining who could and who couldn't. It was just, have you got the knowledge? Have you done the work? Have you worked on yourself? Then you would be at the next stage. Heading to section number 6. Your people arriving. I'm trying to get this done while there's still nobody here. Again, the Cathars called themselves Christians based on the few parts of the New Testament that they recognized. Seeing as the devil was the author of the entire Old Testament, they completely rejected it. They claimed that Abraham, Isaac, Moses, and John the Baptist were all servants of the devil, and that even some believe John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Antichrist. So this is very important to them. John the Baptist is the evil opponent to Christ. There's always a dualism. So either there's a good Christ and John the Baptist, or there are two Christs. There will be a good Christ and a bad Christ. So we'll get into that. Now they could also, in this case, just see John the Baptist as the bad Christ. They could make him Jesus the bad, and the one that they would follow would be Jesus the good. But John the Baptist is evil in Cathar terminology. Again, there's only certain parts of the New Testament that they believed in. One of the reasons that they rejected the Old Testament and called the God there a liar is due to when he first created man, He claimed in Genesis 2:17, "But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." But when Adam and Eve did eat of the tree of knowledge, they in fact didn't die, which proves that this evil God was lying to them. And they basically would claim that the Old Testament God is a psychopath, which is very hard to dispute, of course. Now, they claim when it comes to Christ, and we have to look at this because this is very challenging to understand. And this is one of the reasons where they put themselves in great attack with the Catholic Church. So they had a few possibilities, again, of who this Jesus figure was. So let's look at the possibilities that different Cathar groups would believe slightly different things. One, and this would have been the least likely choice, was that he was a regular flesh and blood man, born out of Rex Mundi, who through work in his own Gnostic doctrine and self-sacrifice came to know reality and the true God, became enlightened and a teacher through his transformation. None of the cross, the reincarnation, the Son of God, none of that would be true. But just he was a living, breathing human person like you or me, who through the use of their own knowledge and their own personal understanding was able to gain complete and total knowledge. I think that would be the least likely choice, but some would have definitely believed that as who Christ was. The second option, I think this is one that is more likely, and again, we're talking about percentages here, is that the good God sent Jesus in the world to help lead humans to wisdom. And for that reason, Jesus could not have been a flesh and blood person, because as soon as you would make a flesh and blood person, that would have to be made by Rex Mundi. The good God could not make something flesh and blood, something material in the world. So as such, if he really was the Son of God, and if the good God of the New Testament really sent Jesus here, he would have to send him in non-physical form, which would mean he would basically be some sort of hologram, that he would have no physical requirements. So he would have no need to eat, he would have no need to drink water, he wouldn't poop, he wouldn't do anything, because he would be exactly the same as a hologram. Looks real on the surface, doesn't have any actual physical materialism to him. And then they would claim that probably the Virgin Mary would then also be a hologram in order to make it the one hologram come from the other hologram, explaining the virgin birth. I think that's how they would do that. Now, as soon as that was done, though, in this theology, that is when Rex Mundi would have sent in an angel Elijah in the form of John the Baptist in order to match this good Christ. And then John the Baptist would have been doing everything to be the opposite of Christ. So if Christ wants to baptize with the Holy Spirit, with fire, John the Baptist wants to baptize with water. And if you think very carefully into the church at Rennes-le-Château that we'll get to, as soon as you enter, the first thing you enter is an image of Rex Mundi, or an image of a devilish feature. They call it Bahamut, but I think it's Rex Mundi on one end, with a water stoop, with the water on his back. On the other side, you see Jesus kneeling over with John the Baptist on top of him, again with water in the shell, and it looks like Rex Mundi and Jesus are about ready to play chess on the floor. That they're, in a sense, to do mental battle with each other. So these two elements need to be kept in mind, that these are very Cathar elements that are being presented. A lot of Cathar elements are being presented in the Rennes-le-Château story, along with, of course, Knights Templar. I don't think there's any difference between the Knights Templar. I should have said this earlier. I don't think there's any difference between the Knights Templar and the Cathars. I think they are one and the same, part of the same group, maybe slightly different elements of it. The Cathars might have been the fully religious order, and the Templars had something slightly different to do. I also don't think the two crusades that happened, which are supposed to happen 100 to 200 years apart, I think they happened at the same time. I think the Cathars and the Knights Templar were taken out at the same time. And in fact, that may have not been in the 11th and 12th, 13th century, but may have been in the 1700s, much, much closer to our time frame. But we'll get to that. But so that's the second possibility, is that Jesus is a hologram sent into the world by God, therefore can't be all. And this becomes important, because then it means to the Cathars that all of the things that he died on the cross for our sins, no, because he can't die, he's a hologram. He was sent here simply as a piece of information and wisdom, The eating of the Eucharist, for example, where you eat the bread and the wine, and to eat the flesh of Jesus would be, again, of course, to a Cathar, impossible, because in this case, Jesus was not a real flesh and blood being. So they would have rejected all of these ceremonies of the Catholic Church based on an incorrect knowledge of who and what Jesus was. There's one more element, and that is, again, that there was two Christs. There was an evil Christ, perhaps John the Baptist, but perhaps not. And this evil John the Baptist, and this evil Christ is the one who would have married Mary Magdalene, would have been physical in this world, would have had children, would have had offspring, would have of course wanted to create more and more evil material beings for them to be brought into the world, and would have created a completely false teaching, and to them would have then become the false teaching of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church would have become the evil teachings through history over time, based on the evil Christ, and that the good Christ, in some of their views, would have appeared as the Apostle Paul. That seems to be, at least who James MacDonald indicates, may have been their depiction of who in the story the good Christ really actually is. So let's take a couple of more elements very quickly here to move on to our closing. These are important elements to understanding Cathar theology and beliefs, at least as we can come down to them. Next is that they were wholly vegetarian. They took the sanctimonious "thou shalt not kill" very seriously. I'm not totally sure why, because of course if they reject the Old Testament, they should have rejected the Ten Commandments as well. But for some reason they seem to have been that the Ten Commandments might have been one of the only things they held firmly from Old Testament teaching. But they chose they would not kill another human being for any reason, and that was one of the reasons they were so easily destroyed in the crusade, because they never actually attempted to block the crusaders or to slow down the crusaders or kill any of the crusaders. If the crusaders wanted to come, arrest them, and burn them at the stake, which is what they did, the Cathars happily went to their own deaths. And again, I'm hoping you're beginning to understand the thinking process behind this, that if they are fully prepared for death, and they are fully prepared to use death as their way out of what they believe to be an evil material world, and a world that is basically just, you could say, a prison world for souls and a prison world for creating souls into slavery, death would not be anything for them to fear, and there'd be no need to try to slow it down or stop it. But they chose not to kill, and they chose not to kill animals. And again, because they believed that a human soul could either, when it dies, if it reincarnates, could go into through things that had sexual intercourse, specific sexual activity, so that soul could go as well into an animal. So they would have held the way, I guess, Hindus see cows, have this incredible veneration of the cow is a really good example. Cathars would have had a very similar way of seeing all animals as being holy. I would assume it's birds. I haven't heard anything about birds. It's claimed they ate fish, because the belief was that fish don't reproduce sexually. That was seemed to be their view of why they could eat fish. I'm not sure I or you would agree with that, but that seems to be their teaching. So they were very strict vegetarians for those reasons, because they felt if they ate an animal, there was a possibility they were eating another one of their human souls. And again, they don't want to. Now, again, if they're not worried about death, and death is a good thing, I don't see why they would necessarily think death of an animal is a bad thing. But it must be the eating of that animal. Just so they wouldn't want to eat one of their fellow humans. They wouldn't want to eat the animal where a human soul had potentially been living. Again, I'm just passing on what we've seemed to have gained of Cathar knowledge. That doesn't mean what I'm saying is 100% correct. And it doesn't mean, because unless we can get back 300, 400, 500, wherever these people were living, and go back in time and talk to them and verify it 100%, everything we're saying here is theory. Everything I'm saying or anyone else is saying about the Cathars is just theory. But I'm presenting the theory as we have it for you to be thinking about them and about where we are now. Again, they preferred to meet outdoors or in private homes than a church. Again, they had no specific priesthood. they had deacons who were like preaching brothers, I guess very similar to not the Amish, but there was Quakers, I guess, where anybody, I guess, could come up if they felt the Holy Spirit had entered them and wanted to share, so that technically the giving priest at any meeting would be the one in the congregation who felt the Holy Spirit had jumped into them. It'd be something similar to that. Again, though, the ones who administer this oath called the Consolamentum, which we'll get to next, traveled in pair. There was a male associus and a female socia. Then they lived together. They shared all of life's hardships and dangers as they traveled through the Languedoc. They tended not to just stay in one place. They tended to travel around as a pair in order to be available, to be wisdom teachers, to, I guess, be healers, to do what was needed. And perhaps they lived at home, at their home base for a certain number of months of the year and were traveling the rest of the time to be available. But there was a male and a female, and they were always working in pairs. They did have a sort of similar to Year Christ. Of course, we found out why they didn't follow the Catholic Year Christ tradition, because of their beliefs, their views on Jesus. But they did have a type of Year Christ ceremony where the blessing of bread was shared between people, but they understood that the substance they were sharing was bread. They were not sharing the flesh of a physical being that to them couldn't have existed if he was the Son of God. And instead, the bread was symbolic of something, of a bond between people. I guess this would be similar to the sharing of a medicine pipe in a sweat lodge. As the pipe is being shared around and you smoke the same pipe and produce the same smoke from the same sacred tobacco, you are all sharing in the connection of that ceremony. So let's move to what I consider the hardest thing to understand of the Cathars, and that is this thing called the Consolamentum. And it's a ceremony that is assumed that once you have this ceremony, you would be cleansed of all of your sins. So your sins would be cleansed, and as long as you sin what they call a sin, which would be, I guess, somehow focused on the material world or killing or eating meat or anything else, that if you follow, as long as you followed a very strict life after this point in time, you were guaranteed not being reincarnated. You were going to be guaranteed moving into the next realm. And for this reason, many people didn't have this until just before death. That just before death, they would have this ceremony done by the perfecti, and then a few hours or a few days later, when they died, as long as they didn't sin in those 2 days, they were clear. I have some concerns about it. The ones who took this ceremony at a younger age were the ones who wanted to become the priests or the healers or the helpers. But again, in accordance to their tradition, once you've held this ceremony, this specific initiation rite, you now had to live your life 100%, and you'll see some of the things you had to do, from fasting to all sorts of stuff. And I guess if you broke any of those tenets after that point, your reincarnation would be incomplete. It would not happen. So that's why so many waited until they were just before death to take this. And again, I have some questions based on what I know about it, or what's being presented about it. I think what's being presented can't be the specifics of it. It would have to be much more detailed, that if you could have just a simple ceremony a day or two before you die and end your reincarnation process. So, but anyway, I'm going to share this with you. They call that this was the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So the Consolamentum is the baptism of fire of Jesus, of the Holy Spirit, as opposed to the baptism of water of John the Baptist. And it is from this Consolamentum that all sin would be removed, reversed all effects of the fall, which the fall to them would be the trapping of the souls in matter, and would restore the original sheath, or the original tunic, they call it, of immortality. Return you to being an angel. This was their only sacrament and their only actual true practice, along with the Lord's Prayer. They would read the Lord's Prayer, but again, it was mostly part of this ceremony. They were now officially, once they had gone through this ceremony, you were now officially have to live the life of an ascetic. They now had to be chaste, so sex was no longer allowed. You were not even permitted to touch members of the opposite sex once you had gone through this ceremony. You were not permitted to tell a lie. You were not permitted to swear an oath. And you were not permitted to kill any living creature. So again, before you had taken this, you could, I guess in theory, you could lie, and you could certainly kill an animal, and you could eat the animal. You could, but once you've taken this ceremony, you could no longer do that. You would also have to undertake 3 40-day fasts per year. A 40-day fast is an intense vision quest. Now, their fast would not be a native Indian fast, which would have no water and no food. I think a Cathar fast was water and bread. But they had to undergo 3 40-day fasts a year after you'd done this ceremony, which would be, the equivalent of having 3 very intense vision quests. And again, you can imagine the kind of knowledge and wisdom that would be coming by this being a part of your expectation after doing this ceremony. It could only be done by, this could only be presented by these perfecti, the men and women who had gone through the ceremony before. Sorry, I have a lot of notes on this. It's hard to see what I want to share with you and what I don't. Of course, you would be expected to live as ascetic before you took this Consolamentum as possible. They would prefer you to not be, of course, having children. They would prefer you not to be eating meat. They prefer you not to be telling lies. They prefer you not, of course. But once you've taken the ceremony, you are now committed to a particular set of very almost monk-like life, or you would lose your reincarnation, or you would lose your escape from reincarnation. It was the spiritual, they claimed that it was the spiritual baptism as properly described in the New Testament. And but it was very simple. There was no material elements. There was certainly no water or anointing oil. And they claim it was the earliest and first ceremony of the Christian Church. I have the entire list of it here. This is the entire list of it, which includes all sorts of things, from reading of certain parts of the New Testament, such as John's Gospel, the touching of the Gospel of the New Testament on the head of the person. There was other perfects who would put their hands on their head when things happened. But it's a very simple, seems very simplistic. That doesn't mean it doesn't have great power, but the basics of it seem quite simplistic. It included a long discussion of the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father who art in heaven prayer. But they didn't just say it. Part of the ceremony was a long, in-depth discussion of what this prayer is, what it means, what every single word in it means, what it refers to, the complete symbolic knowledge of it. And I know there was one person, Richard Rose, who created the TAT Foundation. He mentioned that one person obtained their enlightenment simply by meditating hours and hours and hours a day on the Lord's Prayer. I don't remember the name or who this person was, but that was their path to enlightenment. It was just this one prayer was the only thing they did for hours a day, saying it and looking into it over and over again. So there obviously is something important in that prayer that the Cathars were very key to doing. Last there to discuss is the thing called the Endura, which is when you knew you were close to death and had your Consolamentum and wanted to die quicker, the Cathar would then refuse all food, all bread, all water, in order to increase the quickness that death would come. I'm just sharing that with you. I'm not suggesting that you should or should not do that, but I'm just presenting that. I don't want to go into the details of the crusade and the Inquisition because of time factors. There's lots of that on the internet, and I highly recommend you can go and look up information on the crusades. And again, the Inquisition, the torturing of people to get confessions came for the Cathars. And the one thing I do want to read about the entire crusade and the Inquisition is this little piece of information, which again, I think this is from James MacDonald. I didn't write down who the writer of this was, but when he's talking about the creation of the Inquisition and how the Inquisition worked, because it was all about, a lot of it was about coming to someone's door, knocking on it, saying, do you know someone who's a Cathar? Tell us. give us their name, give us what they did wrong. And of course, if you didn't say anything, if you didn't know any Cathars, you didn't know anybody, then you're the one who would be arrested and tried. So everybody had to come up with something and name somebody so that they wouldn't be arrested and put through the torture chambers. Quite similar to the McCarthy hearings of the 1950s, where, do you know a communist? Tell us a communist. Tell us their name. Tell us how you know they're a communist, and then you could go free. And of course, if you didn't like somebody, if somebody had a problem with you, if you liked someone's wife and wanted them, then you would just say that their husband was a Cathar, go get him killed, and then take the wife for yourself. If you wanted Cathar's property, if you wanted their house, if you wanted anybody's property, you just claim to the Inquisition that they're a Cathar, and as soon as someone is under speculation, they were now guilty, and it was almost impossible to prove their innocence. And I just want to read what, again, James MacDonald brings us to today about this period of the Inquisition and the Cathars. Together, these techniques were responsible for the first effective police state in Europe, where the only thoughts and actions permitted were those approved by the Roman Church, where no one could be trusted, where no duty to totalitarian authority, where duty to the totalitarian authority took precedence over all other duties, whether those duties were one's sovereign, family, friends, religious beliefs, or conscience. Many of the techniques developed by the medieval Inquisition were picked up and later used by totalitarian regimes and police states. Among them are the creation of racial and religious ghettos, the forcible wearing of badges of shame, formalized propaganda and forgery, spying, seizure of property, threats, false promises, intimidation and torture, and disregard for what has long been regarded as natural justice. Because if you were considered to be a Cathar and they didn't kill you, but they let you go from the Inquisition, you then had to wear in shame this yellow cross upon your clothes to show the world that you were a Cathar and that you needed to be treated as like a leper by the rest of society. Similar to, of course, what the Jews had to wear in Germany, and who knows what certain people will be wearing here very soon to show what they're following or not following. So I'm going to end this with two pieces. Again, the Cathars were willing to die. The Cathars were willing to die for their knowledge, for their beliefs, and for their understanding, for their deep wisdom. Their deep wisdom showed them that the wisdom was more important than the material world, and there's nothing that the material world could offer them that could possibly turn them away from their great understanding of leaving hell. To them, this is a dream. And the dream is a nightmare. It's a holographic nightmare reality, and through their Catharism, through their knowledge of reality and of the spirit, they had the portal of escape, and nothing was going to get them to change one bit of what they knew and what they believed and what they were going to do with their life. So I keep that as one of the reasons I'm doing this video. I do want to now quickly add two small points to this. The first is, part of the whole story of the Crusades was that many of the Cathar areas had very strong fortified castles. And if you have to go to southern France just to see how intense these castles are. I mean, the walls are 10, 20 meters thick. I mean, they're not just castle walls. They are impregnable. There's no way you could get in. And it was one of the reasons that that it took so long for the Crusaders to get some of these places, because they just had to wait until they could starve them all out, because there was no way they could get in. But this is the story, that the Cathar castles were partially destroyed during the Crusades in the 1200s. After the Cathars were killed off, new nobles from southern France, as France became a new nation, took over the castles and controlled them. They rebuilt the castles, so this is important. They rebuilt all of the destroyed castles from the Crusades. But then in the 1600s, all of the nobles all over southern France all ran out of money, all at the same time. This is the historical story. And because of that, they couldn't keep the castles anymore. So what they did is they destroyed them on purpose. They claimed that they took a whole bunch of cannons and then blew the very castles up. Now, that of course makes no sense. First of all, they have no money, right? They're broke. The reason they're supposed to give up the castles is because they have no money. So where have they got the money to go get all the cannons, get all the cannonballs, get all the soldiers to be able to blow these things up to start with? They don't have any money. So if you're broke, you can't go blowing things up. And I don't even think the cannons of the time can create the damage you see. Again, go on the internet. I'll leave some links below to some castles you can go take a look at. I don't care how many times you fire 15th, 16th century cannons at those walls, it's not going to have any impact. The walls are built that perfectly. So to me, I think all of this happened at one period of time. It all happened in the 1600s. That's when the Cathar story, the Knights Templar story ended. When the first major world war took place and the first takeover of humanity happened, and the first groups that needed to be taken over were in this area of southern France and in Italy and in Spain, that this entire story of the nobles, and in fact even the entire story of the Renaissance, might be all false. And it's hiding the true story of who is really here and how the knowledge was destroyed, how the knowledge of this reality was started to be taken away from humans. And these Cathar castles, I think, are a perfect example of a very different type of weaponry that was being used and a very different time frame. That I don't think this happened in the 1100s. This happened in the 16th or 17th century. And if you just move all of the stories to that period of time, get rid of this bullshit about the French nobles, you have a much more accurate story of what took place in our history. The second piece I leave you with is that another key element of this very period of time is that this is exactly during Cathar time when the famous stories of the Holy Grail were coming out. That the earliest stories of the Grail romances, which had nothing to do with Jesus, had nothing to do with a cup, but had to do with immortality and knowledge, and was more likely and was more either related as a platter, a lance, a spear, or a stone. And that these early stories of the Grail are exactly during the time of the Cathars and the Knights Templar and to southern France. And there are many stories that the Cathars were either in possession of the Grail or knew what the Grail was and where it could be. There's a famous book they have called the Book of Love, the Book of Mary. And some claim this book may have been the actual Grail. And there's stories of the siege of Montségur, of the Cathars being given 17 days or 15 days to have a special holy feast before they would surrender to the Crusaders, which gave them time to smuggle out the Holy Grail. There are stories of certain Cathars scaling the Pog, scaling the mountain to take the Holy Grail out before the surrender. But I leave all that to you, that there's no question that the Grail romances, they're all connected. The stories of the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, the Cathars, and southern France, and in fact, the earliest stories of the Old Testament are all linked together in this one location on the earth. And it's why I'm going to look into this in much more detail for you. Like I say, I've got hundreds, maybe 500 pages of notes on this region and on the various parts of it that I'm going to be sharing with you more and more as the months go on. But I thought we needed to start with the Cathars because their belief structure and their understanding of reality is most what we need right now today. That a new crusade and a new Inquisition, in a way, is starting. Anyone who doesn't follow the new standard order, anyone who doesn't follow the new authoritarian structure, is going to be the same as the Cathars were in whatever period they lived and whatever period they were crucified. And I want you to begin to really look into Cathar thought, Cathar theology, and more the incredible courage that the Cathars had to have to be willing not to kill those that were coming to kill them, not to try to hurt them in any way, simply to hold their knowledge and allow them to burn them. That's conviction. That's incredible wisdom. That's incredible power in not only living in such a manner, dying in such a manner. And I just want you to keep all that in mind, to where we're headed, to again note that the spiritual warfare, which everything I said in those spiritual warfare videos, I think, perfectly relates to the story of the Cathars. And why this story would also relate to the video I just done previously of why there's nothing to worry about. That if you have, and I don't say you have to be a Cathar, right? But if you have gained similar knowledge of reality and similar knowledge of the self and similar knowledge of the spirit, then no matter what's going on in the material, there's nothing to be worried about. There's nothing to fear, because you have the ultimate knowledge, the ultimate preparation for leaving the nightmare and returning to the light, returning in your own way, your own baptism of the Spirit, the original baptism of the Holy Spirit of Jesus, the trial by fire, the blessing by fire, the baptism by fire. So, for those of you who lasted the entire video again with me, thanks for sitting around and hearing my presentation on what I've researched on the Cathars. I've got, like I said, a few other things coming up, one on the masculine and feminine, one on a few other things that are coming. I'll get to them this week. I'll have some more time. And again, if you have comments, by all means, leave them below. If you have some suggestions, leave them below. I will leave the links and things I have suggested. Subscribe to the channel. That helps. Give a like to the video. That helps the way the YouTube search algorithm works. Check out my books if you think those might be interesting to you. I don't make very much from the books. I only make $2 or $3 on every sale, but they all help, and there might be something useful or interesting in the book, one of the books that I've written. Other than that, if you can also reach me through my website if you want to send a much longer, detailed comment or send me an email. You're more than welcome to do that. The contact is on my website, and we'll see you in the next video.